close the door. The Kena Upanishad speaks of the life of our life breath, that which breathes not with the breath, that by which the life breath is led forward in its paths. Know that to be the Brahman, and not this which men follow after here. And Sri Aurobindo in this chapter, which we are studying now, discusses the nature of this life energy, prana. He makes a clear distinction between the English use of the word life and prana, which in the Upanishad specifically refers to the life force in itself or in its functionings within us. It has a fivefold movement with specific names describing the movements which we have dwelt upon the last 2 times. And he says, of these 5, the respiration is the first of the 5, and this can be suspended without the life being necessarily destroyed, as all the 5 movements can be similarly suspended or modified once we master their working. The concept of life force itself is then discussed, which also we had seen. He says it is not the material substance or the material energy, but it supports matter and is involved in it, and unless it occupies all form and supports it, there could be no physical form. It acts in all material forces, and it comes closest to itself where the material force abstracts itself and becomes practically non-material to a grade of pure force. And in this way, our mind can begin to understand the nature of this character of prana. And he says all material aspects are only field and form of the prana, which is in itself a pure energy, their cause and not their result. And therefore, physical processes, physical analysis can only look at combinations of physical processes but cannot know prana in itself. How then do we become aware of its existence? And that's the theme now. But before we proceed, we try to prepare our minds that we can understand prana in its true sense and not tend to fall back into the old habitual idea of a physical energy. The concept of physical energy is a great step in the last 200 years of modern science's explorations, but it tends to reduce the true nature and source of this energy. We are taught in our textbooks that there is energy. It's a very bad way of teaching, but that's a different story. Energy. And what is energy? And then the textbook says, oh, you see, when an object falls, it is potential energy, gravitational energy. In electricity, it is electrical energy. In heat, it is calorific energy. The other is magnetic energy. All of these are energy. Now, to a child, this is enormously confusing and leaves us with a very vague, confused concept of energy. The right way would have been to go from the near to the far. You experience the processes, the flows of energy, and then come to an abstract concept, but whatever that means. There is this idea of something common, overarching as a concept. It is described through its physical vehicles, but you never dwell on the thing itself. What is it that becomes heat energy? What is it that becomes electrical energy, or gravitational, or magnetic, or any other form of energy? We are told that our muscles pushing are also an expression of energy, but when we observe the actual working of the muscles inside the fibers and tissue, it resolves itself into some form of calorific energy. That is, something has to burn to give off heat, or some form of electrical energy. That is, an electrical signal has to come through the nervous system to activate and make the muscle twitch. And then something has to burn to provide for the nourishment for the muscles to be able to continue twitching. But what is it that comes as electricity or as this calorific energy? It's not discussed. In fact, when we speak of calorific energy, they speak of calories which are burnt up to release heat. But that means the heat capacity was hidden in the calories, and the burning process is only releasing and exposing it. What was hidden, and why does it take this form and not an electrical form or a magnetic form or any other? It's not discussed. So we are left with a kind of a blurred idea, and we think of energy, we tend to fall back to its physical representations and stop there. But here Sri Aurobindo is ensuring that we get free of such wrong notions before we move to the actual sense of how we can know the prana in itself. Think of it this way. Prana being essentially pure force without form, not tied to any process, but supporting all process and occupying all form. It can be brought to occupy a form and infused into a form. It can be withdrawn from the form, apparently not changing necessarily the form, depending on how much is withdrawn, directed to another form. Or it can exist outside all forms and be drawn into it or removed. It can be present in the form without being activated, latent potential. Or it can imprint itself into the form and as if activate the form, but itself never being tied to the form or its processes. So look at it this way. If we are holding in our hand a bunch of chemicals which are going through their normal process of chemical reaction, if at that point you infuse the prana into that substance, the same chemical processes which are ongoing, which are currently sustained by the intrinsic prana in them, the same processes will enormously speed up. Suddenly now the chemical process, instead of taking 5 minutes to complete, will happen perhaps within 5 seconds. And then it will appear like a miracle. If you take an object which has capacity to hold electricity, like a battery, and you put a bulb upon it, the bulb is dim, you say the battery is weak, it is losing its power. And somebody takes that battery and infuses into it prana and gives it back, you'll find the light is now brighter. The actual chemical content of the battery has not changed, but the driving motive force of the chemical process itself, which was always the prana, has now been increased, intensified, and so the effect in the physical chemical is amplified and happens faster. The same thing would be in the hand, because our body being also a bundle of chemical processes, among other things, led by the intrinsic prana. If you were to infuse into the hand a large amount of prana, all those chemical processes would tend to speed up. The hand would feel warmer. The biological processes which base themselves on the chemical processes inside the cells would also speed up. The cells would now begin to rejuvenate, grow faster. So if there was an injury in that part, the healing would take place faster, and so on. The prana could similarly be transmitted from a person into an object across a distance. Instead of having to hold it, you have the battery, the person concentrates, infuses pranic energy into it, and its operation is thus amplified. So wherever prana is infused, all the physical processes involving what we call physical energy flows of any kind are all amplified, intensified by the imprint, the pressure of the pure force. But pure force itself is not moving. Its effect is on things which are moving to amplify their movement. It can express itself, the pure prana can express itself as movement or not. But the movement is not a physical movement. It is a movement of the pressure of force pushing to activate. It is in this sense that we need to first begin to recognize the sense of prana. And this is extremely important because the tools by which we are going to recognize prana, we have seen, cannot be physical because they can only measure physical processes. So the tools left for us, finally, are something which is non-physical and yet can experience physicality. And what is that? The only thing we know is ourselves, our consciousness, our body. And so this is what Sri Aurobindo points to. How then do we become aware of its existence? By that purification of our mind and body, and that subtilization of our means of sensation and knowledge, which become possible through yoga. So we have a means of sensation. We feel our fingers. We can feel the temperature on our fingers. And you can say, oh yes, there's a breeze moving in this direction because one side is cooler than another side. That's our means of sensation. And with the means of sensation, there is a power of knowledge which is involved there. One could simply have come to a wrong conclusion and said, oh, because the sunlight is coming on the other side, this side feels cooler. There is an insight which is almost a kind of a secret working of intuition which guides to give you a deeper and truer knowledge. But it stops there at a very physical level. By the process of yoga, the means of sensation are subtilized. Now I feel not only the wind blowing, not only the coolness of the perspiration evaporating, I can feel there is something in the air, like an electricity. One feels often on a stormy day, before even an external sign of storm or lightning is sensed, one feels in the air a kind of an electricity. It's not yet physical, but it is there. And one can sense, oh yes, today there might be lightning and rain. How do you know? I can smell it, someone says. But it's not a physical smell, it's more a sensation through the physical senses and something of the intuition which points out and says, this is it. The smell of the flower is not it, the smell of the water around and the sea breeze is not it. This particular quality of the smell, this is the new thing, this indicates that. So the intuition guiding also has been subtilized. So the subtilization of our means of sensation and knowledge, which become possible through yoga. Not only this, purification of mind and body, along with this subtilization. As long as the mind and body are dull, crude, even if there is a subtilization of the senses, it would not gel. In fact, the first requirement is for these to be pure before there can be subtilization of the senses and of the knowledge. Now, as we describe it, the knowledge part belongs to the mind, the sensation belongs to the something closer to the physical body. But as they become subtilized, the part which is sensing is no more the gross body, but a subtler sense. For example, one can become conscious of the subtle physical in the body itself, around the body, and its interaction with things. One can even consciously extend it to other objects or even sense objects through it. This is how many of the processes of psychokinesis are achieved, where some part of the subtle physical body is actually felt and then extended and projected beyond the gross body, but densified enough that it can interact with a material object and push. Who leads? The mind. So we have come to a gradation of sensitivity of the senses where it has the character of physicality, but as much involves the mind as the senses which we knew to be physical. In fact, at that moment, your senses have become subtle enough not to be gross physical. But they have the same character, so at first one doesn't distinguish. The same sensitivity now extended, your mind turns to a person or an object or a situation and tries to feel very quietly, and one senses a quality, a clouding or a light, a dullness or a sense of freedom, and one can describe what it is, the nature of the energy or the thought or the sensation in or around that situation or person. And all of these become naturally possible by the action of the yoga, by the processes of yoga which subtilize following the purification. And this is going to be our means now to feel the prana. We become effectively the laboratory. And now when we become the laboratory with such means which are non-physical, we are capable of a higher grade of analysis. So he says, we become capable of analysis other than the resolution of forms into their gross physical elements. The old way of analysis of the material process was break it up, go deeper into smaller and smaller pieces, but it explains nothing. It just describes a process that nature used to form this, but it explains nothing. Sri Aurobindo's classic example is water. You split water, you get hydrogen and oxygen. And you say, now we know how water is made. But you will find nothing in hydrogen which corresponds to the water experience, nothing in oxygen which corresponds to the water experience, nothing in their mixture. You can mix the two gases, you will still not get water. You put a spark and hydrogen burns, rather it combines with oxygen, and suddenly you have water, which has completely different qualities from hydrogen and oxygen or the spark. How does that happen? It is as good as saying, I take a little bit of sand, I take a little bit of water, I mix the two things, and I will get gold. That would be considered a miracle. That's really what's happening. These two gases are somehow combined in a way that we can never explain. They just combine, and we have this completely different material. And Sri Aurobindo points to such examples to say that finally we have only described how nature built water by combining these two materials. But what water is, we do not know, cannot describe. So, resolution of forms into their gross physical elements is one way of analyzing, which really explains nothing. But we become capable of a different way of analyzing and are able to distinguish the operations of the pure mental principle from those of the material, and both of these from the vital or dynamic, which forms a link between them and supports them both. So we briefly read this last time. These are the three stages by which we become conscious of the prana. First, we become conscious of the pure mental principle and learn to separate it from the physical, material. And then separate both of them from this vital, and that's when we become aware of the vital prana in itself. Until then, anyone who says, I'm aware of the prana flowing in me, is only aware of an operation of prana in the gross body or in the mind, but not able to isolate prana itself. Because in our experience, we have prana entering mind to give us a mental life, prana entering physical body to give us a physical life, but we do not experience prana in itself. Because prana splits into these two operations, the domain of life energy in us is also split into what is called lower vital and higher vital. Lower vital is the part of the prana working when it's embedded or dependent on the gross body and mixed in it. Part which is dependent in the mind and dependent or mixed in it is the higher vital, and that's all there is to it. But we do not know in itself the prana. For that, you would have to step back from both higher vital and lower vital and experience it in itself. So first, let's observe what it's like when we are aware in the mental principle, distinguish the operations of the pure mental principle from those of the material. So, as we are now, let's say we feel energetic in the body, that would be an operation of the life force in the body. In the mind, it takes the form of bright energy of mind. You wake up fresh in the morning, there is a quality of the body being fresh. I feel like I can jump, I can run 10 kilometers and not get tired. But there's a different quality of freshness in the thinking. My mind is so clear and fresh. It's like I can read anything and understand it. My mind is so clear that right now I could sit down and write 20 pages perhaps without becoming tired. Or the opposite can happen, that my body is fresh but my mind is dull. Or my mind is fresh but my body is dull. This is often the case when we have what is called jet lag. You go from one side of the earth to another side, let's say 12 hours to exaggerate the difference. You're sitting in one of the Americas, one of the countries of the North or South America, almost on the opposite side from India, and you find within a day or two you're struggling with sleepiness during the day, and at night you're as if half awake. But if you observe the nature of this sensation, within 2 days normally the mind catches up, but the body is as if lagging. The body functions are happening according to the rhythm of the old place. So during the evenings, the intestines move as if now it's time to evacuate. Sometimes in the evenings, the eyes put out this little powdery, greeny dust which you have in the morning when you wake up. The operation for accumulating that and pushing it out kicks in the evening rather than early morning. 12 hours off. And you notice all your biological functions are as if operating on the time zone from which you have moved out. But the mind has shifted. And so what happens, during the daytime, you find you are able to think, but the thinking is dulled because the body is sleepy. And then at night it reverses. The mind is sleepy, but the body is now awake. So there's a kind of a restlessness which prevents the mind from sleeping. It takes a few days and then eventually the body catches up. Sometimes the sense of catching up is a shifting of the time until it comes back. In such experiences, one is able to notice how the two are operating completely differently. But otherwise, simply becoming aware, you notice that there's a quality of freshness of the mind which is different from a quality of freshness of the body. And then, this mind can be directed. So we find in our hand, for example, we can direct our mental awareness and intensify the hand's awareness, which is very different from the hand itself being fresh. And we are thus beginning to separate the operations of the pure mental consciousness from the gross physical. Distinguish the movements. So, distinguish the operations of the pure mental principle from those of the material, and both of these from the vital and dynamic, which forms a link between them and supports them. So here comes the tricky part. You now have to observe what is it that is common between the mind and the life and the body freshness, and how you can transition from the mind's freshness, mind's energy, and imprint it into the body's energy. It's as if with your mind's will, you make your body fresh, will it into awakening. Or your mind is dull, your body is fresh, you shift the energy to the mind and will it into awakening. And you notice you're moving energy as if across these two levels. And that's when you begin to feel this as a separate thing. We are then able to distinguish the movements of the pranic currents, not only in the physical body, which is all that we are normally aware of, but in the subtle frame of our being, which yoga detects underlying and sustaining the physical. So in the physical body, we are aware of the pranic energy as it flows when there's a rush of energy. But in the mental body, similarly, one is able to now feel and by the mind's will direct it. And that's when one begins to have a real skill and control over it. And then one can combine the two things. It's a very simple experiment you can attempt. You extend your hand out like that, arm stretched horizontally, and then have somebody gently press down. And you'll find at a certain point his strength, because of the leverage involved, they can push your hand down easily. And then you relax your arm and concentrate and visualize. It's not really a visualization, it's more a sensation, but most people can't do it. So you visualize and then try to feel life force, the sensation of life energy, and energy streaming through the arm until it becomes dense and gushing energy. And then have the same person push down with the same force, and you'll find your arm stays up. He'll have to put much more force to push down, and you will feel much less effort to retain it. It's a very simple experiment. One could do it just now, but you can try it on your own. All depends on the extent of the flow of energy that one has activated. Who activated it? It was not part of the normal body function. It was the mind dwelling on life force. Perhaps initially simply a visualization doing it. But if by then you have developed the capacity to feel life force, you can just will it and direct it. And immediately all the functions of the muscles have now become amplified. Remember what we discussed earlier, where life force comes, everything becomes now intensified. And so suddenly, with much less effort, your arm is stronger. When people, before gymnastics, are taught to stretch their body, they call it warming up, as a way of preventing cramps. You warm up the body and then you start doing your gymnastics or athletics. You'll notice the intention is implanted. You're putting your attention on the different parts of the body successively and stretching them and somehow activating so that afterwards when you do something you will not get the cramp. You notice the key there is the activation of awareness in all those parts. And as you activate that awareness, you are imprinting with the mind the prana and amplifying it and putting an intention, directing it. Now it has to be activated. Just a few stretches done with this intention and you find your body is now already full of energy, glowing with a kind of freshness. And then when you start running, suddenly you do not get cramps because the functioning of the prana flow in the muscles has been activated. And now when the muscles are exerting more than normal, there is not a knot, there is not a blockage which would have led to the cramp. If you had not activated consciously and your body is not used to having a free flow of the prana, there's a block there, you start using more than normal, which is what we do walking at home or going from here to there. You start running 200 meters at a high speed, abnormal operation of body function. The prana is not flowing, there's a tiny block and it piles up quickly. There's a lack of energy in the muscular working, there's a breakdown of tissue or the chemical functions, you have a cramp. It's a knot. In fact, when you get a cramp, it feels like the muscle is knotted up. And the way to release the physical knot is to press the muscle, twist, shape, stretch, as if a knot is being released. The knot actually exists in the subtle body, in the subtle physical, the energetic flow. And what you've done is consciously releasing it, preparing it, imprinting an intention, making sure the flow is reasonably clear, and then you amplify the activity, there's no problem. But if in your body the flow of prana has already been made sufficiently clear and pure, the channels of prana flow in the gross body and the subtle body are clear, you do not need warming up. You can simply start running with full intensity and not get a cramp. Such is the case in those who practice asanas and pranayam and have taken it to a certain level that the body is sufficiently conscious and the prana flows freely. I give the example of the mother, not so much for running, but it was a description given to us by the head of the then head of the engineering section, who was there from a young childhood, recording mother's talks in the playground. And he said he has seen mother for years together. She would sit on the chair, she would be having the class, she would meet people, and the whole thing would go on for 3 full hours. Never once in the body was there restlessness. And at the end of the 3 hours, she will look, no one else left, and she will get up straight. No stretching, no cramping, no part of the muscle which feels a little tight, a little restless, or some jam of flow of blood which has led to numbness somewhere. Nothing at all. Not even needing to take the support of the arms of the chair. She would look and straight get up and walk straight off. After 3 hours of being seated continuously, and at that age, well, let's say she was going to the playground until the age of 85, almost 84, about. And consider that at the age of perhaps 50, or when already some degeneration of the body has begun, you start getting a little back pain from sitting too long, or some part of the leg or thighs become numb from compression, blood flow is blocked, or whatever reason biology gives. But when the pranic energy is streaming free in the gross and subtle bodies, none of this happens. Effectively, the capacity of the body is accessible freely to do whatever it wants. Even when that prana is infused strongly enough, it can override biological limitations. You can do more than the body with purely physical effort would be capable of. We'll come to some of these things shortly. So we're describing this distinction between prana in the physical body and in the subtle frame of our being. We are then able to distinguish the movements of the pranic current not only in the physical body, which is all that we are normally aware of, but in that subtle frame of our being, which yoga detects underlying and sustaining the physical. So you become conscious of this subtler gradation of subtle body, sukshma deha, subtle body as distinct from gross body. And in that you can feel the prana flow, and its flows are different from the gross body. How does one do that? How does one develop this capacity? And the conventional means used in the Hatha Yoga and to some extent in the Raja Yoga are described. This is ordinarily done by the process of pranayam, the government and control of the respiration. By pranayama, the Hatha Yogin is able to control suspend and transcend the ordinary fixed operation of the pranic energy, which is all that nature needs for the normal functioning of the body and of the physical life and mind. And he becomes aware of the channels in which that energy distributes itself in all its workings, and is therefore able to do things with his body which seem miraculous to the ignorant. So by pranayam, we learn to govern and control the breathing. Remember, it's only the first of the 5 functions of the life energy in our body. And as this control develops, he is able to control the operations of the life force, and through it, the operations of the body. From that control, we are able to suspend certain operations and eventually transcend those operations. Now, the transcendence of the operations involves the ability to, if you can suspend, you can also amplify. If you can suspend and amplify freely, you are no more dependent on that particular process, and you can rise above that process and simply infuse life force and achieve that same result by willing it. So the ordinary fixed operations of the pranic energy are then transcended. Now, what are these fixed operations? The most obvious is breathing. So we need to have so much, let's say, volume of oxygen per minute to sustain the freshness of the blood and thereby the operations of the body. We need so much food to be taken in so that the body can absorb the calories by which the calorific processes are sustained in the body, and so on. When we modulate the prana directly and through it the actions of the body, you can reduce the breathing enormously. We have seen earlier you can even suspend it without the life being destroyed, but also reduce the food. And the result is a person who seems to eat a handful perhaps of food for the whole day, and yet the body is full of vigor and energy throughout the day, working more than a person half his age. And this is the case we see with many hatha yogis, and always full of energy, never getting tired. Where do the calories come from in the body? You can ask this question to the scientist, and the scientist measures and says, we don't know. Somehow the body is able to manage. And this has been measured in the laboratory conditions in many circumstances. The heartbeat can be slowed down and even stopped with the person fully conscious and able to function normally and speak normally. The breathing similarly slowed down and made nominal or even stopped for long periods with the person still able to be conscious. The brain waves completely normal. And of course, after a while, the person resumes. So these would be normal processes: heartbeat, breathing, digestive process, and then the calorific burning processes. All of these can be modified, suspended. But then, this is all that nature needs for the normal functioning of the body, of the physical life and mind. And so nature keeps a very small, simple movement of energy in normal grooves with a normal quantity, and that's enough for what we call our normal life. An athlete who is now pushing the boundaries of his endurance is pushing a very narrow track of the capacity of the energy is working. And as he keeps doing it, within a few months, the body energy flows have been readjusted. For that purpose, now he is able to do what he couldn't do before with ease. Somebody else could push the same energy flow to something else, to teaching the body to heat up. And you'll find the body now learns to be in a cold space without needing to put on warm clothes. One of the recent famous hatha yogis, many of the hatha yogis demonstrate this easily, but there was one who had strong political influence and so was famous, someone by the name Dhirendra Brahmachari. He used to go around in the snow-clad regions of the Himalayas and with barely one thin cloth covering his body and the dhoti normally worn, if necessary, could walk barefoot and not feel cold at all, while everyone around him would be clad in these very thick layers. But there is a technique which is taught, which in Tibet takes on the name of the tsumo. In India, it has other names and variations, by which you teach the body, or rather teach your life energy to heat up the body at will to whatever degree necessary, or to suspend the amount of food necessary, and so on. It can be taught, the point being, all of these can be taught. But what you're doing is you're pushing, teaching the life force to go beyond the normal circuit and limited flow, which is the rhythm nature has set for your normal life. If you just followed a basic discipline and slowly stretching the limits in any activity, as for running endurance, you're already doing the same thing, unconscious of what's really happening within you. You just find your capacity increases. I had read of a British diver who trained his body to dive to a depth of almost 8 meters, I believe, 8 or 9 meters. That's a pressure level at which the pressure of the water is enough to crush your lungs. He made his body supple enough first by stretchings, and then the time it takes to go down and to return, because you have to return slowly, otherwise the bubbles which form in the blood would burst your brain's vessels. So you have to return very slowly. The time required was 2.5 minutes. So he taught himself to hold his breath, to swim down, and made the body sufficiently supple that it could be collapsed. The lungs could be collapsed without breaking the bones or getting crushed. And in that compressed state of the air in the collapsed lungs, you remain there and then come up. And having done it with himself, he taught it to others. Of course, the method is, slowly pushing the limits, preparing the body by every means possible. But what are you doing when you prepare the body, when you make it supple? Behind it all, there is an intention held in the mind. I want to make, by this stretching, make the body supple, make it capable of this. That intention in the mental body, in the mental consciousness, by constant repetition is infusing itself into the gross body and in the life force processes and modifying slightly, pushing, nudging. Unconscious. But if you become conscious of the life force in the subtle body and gross body, the same thing could be done simply by willing, directly channeling, modifying the flow of life force. Of course, the gross part would still have to be taught to be stretched, but by pushing the life energy on it, you could achieve the same suppleness much faster. And he becomes aware of the channels in which that energy distributes itself in all its workings, and is therefore able to do things with his body which seem miraculous to the ignorant. And these channels are different from the gross body nervous system channels or the gross body's arteries. And we will come to a very interesting text which Sri Aurobindo has, let's say, recorded, not written because he doesn't claim authorship of it. But still, it is not out of alignment with his overall yoga and philosophy, in which all this process is described with great minuteness. And that's such a long text, we won't take it up today, but we will continue that next time. Key ideas in that are these, that the gross body is nothing but a materialization or an image made in matter of the form and the energetic working of the subtle body, having certain direct correspondences and certain points of direct connection, which are the chakras, of course. But because it is made in the image of the subtle body, in the subtle body is the key to its freedom from limitations. But in the subtle body, the system of energy flow is completely different from the gross body's energy flows. The link points being the chakras, the correspondence stops there. So This is the reason why in the yogic texts you will find charts of energy flow called nadis. And depending on how one categorizes, the crossing points of the nadis are then described with specific terms. Where two lines cross, there's a particular term. Where three lines cross, there's a particular term. Where many lines accumulate, we call it chakra. Where three lines cross, I believe it's called marma. But there are also centers of energy, focal points of energy, where as if many wires are crossing. So that point you could catch and do something there, and all those wires, to use that analogy, all those energy flows would be affected. Which energy flows correspond to which operation of life energy in the mental body, in the subtle body, and in the gross body. These are mapped out in great detail. And so, by concentrating on the marma center, knowing that this particular line connects to the operation of the liver, for example, liver function, you can poke on the arm, push that point, of course not just physically, but energetically, and affect, stimulate, or soften the working of the liver. Because that's the link, the connection there. It's literally like a physical wiring where you have telephone wires coming. By combining certain wires, connecting them, you link people, you link, transfer information, knowledge, connect them. Or by activating certain wires in a robotics, in the robot, you make the arm move or the leg move. This is obvious in the physical nervous system, where the links are physical. But the operations of the physical organs are dependent on energy flows of the subtle nervous system. We will not use the word nervous, we will say nadis. Subtle passages of energy flow. And so the whole knowledge is based on that, of which you see the derived form of what is called acupuncture or acupressure. In acupuncture you stick needles, but it would not be enough if the needle was stuck by a machine. It is the person who sticks the needle whose energy, consciousness, intention is having a greater effect. In the act of sticking the needle in the same particular nadi, you can block the nadi or intensify the energy, depending on how you activate it. Now in the system that is taught, and of course there are several schools, they will say when you insert in this way, rotate clockwise, it will have this effect, rotate anti-clockwise, it will have that effect. If you look at the principle behind, it doesn't matter. Your intention, your thought that rotating clockwise is having this effect of amplifying the flow is helping you direct the intention of the mind into the physical contact point and the energy there. Because you believe that and hold that as your intention, it has that effect. And therefore, the school of belief that you belong to is extremely important. Because you're dependent on the belief system to be your interface between your intention and the physical action and the directing of the energy. And this is the reason why such techniques are all useful, are all effective, but they are operative and effective within the belief system of the school to which you belong. You can rise above them and acquire a capacity which is not dependent on such specific knowledge and techniques. And then you put an energy intended there, with or without the entry of the needle, and have the result that you intend. With or without contact of the finger, as in acupressure, and have the result there. So in its most advanced form, the master of the marma vidya, meaning the knowledge of the marmas in the body, the master can concentrate and with his finger point and have the result. Or remove the finger, simple pure concentration, and the result is achieved. I have seen many years ago, now it must be at least 25 years, in one of the magazines, The Week, they had an interview with one such, not master but skilled practitioner of Marma Vidya. In fact, he had been studying under a master, and the master threw him out saying he was not good enough, There was some limitation of incapacity and dropped him halfway through, perhaps because of impurity of purpose or something, because they are very careful about conveying this knowledge only to those who are capable of using it rightly and not misusing. So he was a reject from the school. And he came out into public and spoke of and demonstrated his capacity. So in the magazine they showed pictures. Those days television was not yet so strong. Somebody rushing towards him, and then he points at the person, and halfway through as the person approaches, the person loses consciousness and collapses on the ground. And he explained that if you approach gradually, it is not so effective. You have to approach with a lot of violent energy. Then the intervention on the marma is very effective and can immediately turn that energy around and make you fall unconscious. And so there were pictures, a series of pictures, and he demonstrated with many people. I don't know if the person is still around, but such a demonstration would not be seen in favorably by those who have the knowledge, and there would have been some intervention to make him quiet and withdraw. But you can see the potential for misuse and therefore the necessity of secrecy. But the same principle could be used to heal, to regenerate, to help in a way. But it can be done even without needing the specific knowledge. That's the point I'm getting to. By direct influence, a direct application of the will through the prana. Once the capacity to wield the prana directly has been awakened. So he becomes aware of the channels in which the energy distributes itself in all its workings, and is therefore able to do things with his body which seem miraculous to the ignorant. Just as the physical scientist, by his knowledge of the workings of material forces, is able to do things with them which would seem to us magic if their law and process were not divulged. So if you look at the conventional scientific experiments, you wrap a wire around a metal, touch it to a battery, and the metal starts attracting magnetically other iron pieces. Now, to somebody who does not know what is magnetism or the operation of electricity or the necessity of the battery or the wire connection, it would appear magical. It would be, or even the light bulb. You connect it to this object and suddenly there's light. And you do not know why. Something is necessary here. Some power is held which goes and there creates the light. And that's all you know. But I see nothing moving. Where is the light coming from? I only know light when something is burnt, and here I see nothing burning. So they will speak of a candle without a flame. That's the only vocabulary you have. And there are descriptions of this kind in various older texts or people having seen such things. But the same thing is now accessible to you because you have a skill of this knowledge. But what can you do with this? Things which would seem to us magic or the miraculous in the body, by such redirection of the life energy. Okay, we saw an example of someone being knocked unconscious, somebody being healed, food, reliance on food being changed, body able to generate heat or cold at will, the person able to generate with his body so much heat that steam is produced. So many martial arts masters demonstrate this. They take a towel, a wet towel, and put a foil of aluminium inside and wrap it in the towel, concentrate, and after a while you find steam coming out. Now the metal is required in order to create some contrast and some point of support where the life force can go and activate for heat. The wet cloth is required because when the metal gets so hot, it could burn the skin. So you need something to insulate, and the water there turning to steam is also visually dramatic to show you the increase of temperature. Or you modify the body's weight, increase it or reduce it. We saw that as an example. And all of these different kinds of things seem miraculous, but when you think of what's happening inside, oh, he manipulated this nadi, activated that particular operation of life force, oh yeah, that makes sense. It's as simple as that, just as you say electricity passing through metal, heating it up, producing light. For all the workings of life in the physical form are governed by the prana. And not only those which are normal and constant, and those which, being always potential, can be easily brought forward and set in action, but those which are of a more remote potentiality and seem to our average experience difficult or impossible. So he's describing 3 grades of action of life force in the body. The normal and constant, which is what sustains our body, and those which, being potential, can easily be brought forward and set in action. So the ability to generate heat would be one such. Generate enormous amounts of heat, because heating is a process normal, but the excessive energy and the capacity for excessive energy is potential, can be brought easily forward. Similarly, reduction of food can be brought forward. But beyond that, those which are of a more remote potentiality, which seem to our average experience difficult or impossible, and these we see in certain forms of levitation or certain kinds of action which involve psychokinesis, certain kinds of biological processes where an entire limb can be regenerated, or there's a particular technique called kaya kalpa in which the entire body is regenerated and made young again, which is bypassing the conventional physical process of aging and so on. But the most dramatic of these is the ability for the body to be put into suspended animation at will, which we had discussed last time. And of this, I will read a passage from Sri Aurobindo's own comment, where in the Record of Yoga, he discusses, and we will see the other text which I have referred to, which is part of this in greater detail next time. So here he describes how exactly this capacity of to suspend the body's operations or modify them freely, how it happens, and the siddhis of the body of mahima, laghima, anima, invulnerability and incorruptibility of the body, how these are achieved. I had mentioned last time, you will recall, the sword being hit on the body and the body being invulnerable. So he says, these powers, they depend primarily on the replacement of the ordinary 5-fold processes of prana, apana, vyana, samana and udana by the single simplified action of the original or elemental force of prana. The infinite vital energy surcharged with electricity, Vaidyutam. That's the secret. In one go, he gives you the secret. What's the secret? Exactly what we have been discussing now. You transcend the conventional operations, come to the awareness of the pure life energy, and bring its direct simplified action, not dependent on these subsidiary 5-fold processes and their further subsidiary nerve channels. As long as you're bound to that secondary or tertiary process, you're dependent on the limitations of that process. You come back to the pure action of the essential prana. Replace the ordinary 5-fold process by the single simplified action of the original or elemental force of prana. And that's why it's so important in the awareness itself to be able to come back to that layer of a pranic awareness. And then in that you have an infinite energy surcharged with electricity. You imprint directly for the same function intended. But because you've bypassed those nerve channels, you're able to get across those limits and infuse directly on the tissue or infuse on any part of the body any of the operations earlier dependent on those indirect processes directly. So on the skin, infuse in the tissue an invulnerability, and then it can be struck by a sharp sword and still not experience a cut. On the overall body, imprint the sustenance of the life directly, not dependent on processes, and therefore the processes can be shut down, the life is still operational. And here you get the insight. And when you think about it, it sounds pretty obvious. It makes a lot of sense. So all of this becomes possible once we understand. And this is like a science, itself a science of the subtle energy and its operations. But then he says, there is a double operation of the life energy, the part operating in the body and the part operating in the mind. And these two now have to be distinguished. And working on the chakras, all of this will be the discussion next time. But we will look at the larger body of the text where he discusses this relationship, and it's part of the text of the Record of Yoga. And we will get further insight into this operation of life force. Now we could have skipped all this and just gone on with the main point of this chapter, which is what is it behind life energy, which is the cause of life energy's working. That being Brahman. But Sri Aurobindo has taken trouble to map out all these operations of life force, show us how bit by bit we can disengage from the limited operation of life energy and recover the full freedom of life energy, and thereby acquire to such an extraordinary freedom of the mind and body. And if he has taken trouble to map out these steps, it is because this is a necessary part of the yogic development, though you may achieve it by different means, more direct than Hatha Yoga or Raja Yoga, asanas and pranayam. But they are still nevertheless part of the physical siddhi, especially in the integral yoga, which aims to fully liberate the body consciousness and make it a vehicle for a divine and a supramental action. So all of these are relevant to understand this, though the means will be different in the integral yoga. And therefore we take time to study this. But when we then recognize the continuity of this life operation to the higher life of our life, we will see how that life of our life can override all this lower working of the inferior life force and infuse the dynamic life, the divine life energy directly on the prepared instrument. And that would be the basis for the divine energy to stream in and replace the working of physical prana and mental prana by a divine energy which has the same capacity but is different in substance, of a superior grade. And it is only when that happens that the transformation of the life energy takes place. So all of it is relevant in this larger perspective. And we'll continue this text next Sunday. So to have a presentation like this is rare. I can say that having seen a lot of literature of the Hatha Yogic or Raja Yogic kind, you find their detailed mapping of the nadis and their operations. But there is not the knowledge which liberates you from that process and their limitation. Here, in a very brief series of steps, he summarizes and brings us to that kind of knowledge. And that's why this text is so important.